Workers, comrades, brothers and sisters in struggle, open your eyes, for you are living inside an empire so sophisticated, so polished, so perfectly constructed that it steals your power while convincing you to applaud the theft. You wake each morning believing you navigate a world of choices, freedoms, and opportunities, yet every path you walk has been paved by those who profit from your labor and thrive on your obedience. What you call reality is not neutral, it is engineered. What you call freedom is not genuine, it is curated. What you call progress is not yours, it belongs to those who own the tools, the factories, the markets, and the very narratives that define your life. This is the empire of illusions, and its greatest triumph is not exploitation, it is distraction. Capital no longer merely commands your labor, it commands your attention, your desires, your imagination. It shapes what you dream of and what you fear. It trains you to see your worth through wages, your happiness through consumption, your identity through brands, and your future through debts that bind you more firmly than chains. It convinces you that inequality is natural, that hardship is personal failure, that wealth is the reward for virtue, and that the powerful deserve their thrones. In every corner of society, from the factories to the screens, from the office to the marketplace, capital whispers the same message: stay divided, stay silent, stay busy, and do not question the order of things. But I am here to tear away that veil. For beneath the illusions lies a simple, brutal truth. The working class creates all wealth, and yet receives only the crumbs of its own labor. This truth, exposed again and again in the writings of Marx, remains unchanged. The machinery grows more complex, the markets more global, the technologies more dazzling, but the fundamental relation remains as it has always been: those who own command and those who labor obey. The conditions may evolve, but exploitation adapts with equal speed. Where once the worker was chained to the machine, today the worker is chained to the algorithm, the paycheck, the rent, the endless cost of living engineered to keep you too exhausted to resist. Capital does not merely drain your toil, it drains your time, the one resource no worker can replenish. It drains your collective strength, convincing each of you that you stand alone. It drains your consciousness, saturating your days with noise so constant that the very notion of resistance feels distant, impractical, even impossible. This is not accidental. It is the logic of a system built on maintaining the hierarchy between those who own the world and those who build it. Yet history shows us something the ruling class hopes you never remember. Every structure of domination trembles the moment workers begin to think together. The greatest danger to the empire is not rebellion, it is clarity. When the worker recognizes that their suffering is not individual but collective, not natural but constructed, not inevitable but engineered, the empire begins to crack. When illusions dissolve, power shifts. When the exploited cease to blame themselves and begin to question the system, the ground beneath capital shakes. And so the rulers work tirelessly to prevent that awakening. They drown you in entertainment, bury you under competition, suffocate you with fear, and promise you freedom while stealing your agency. They want you fragmented, not unified, distracted, not organized, surviving, not living. For they know what Marx made clear across his writings: the unity of the working class is the death sentence of every oppressive system. Comrades, the time has come to reclaim what has always belonged to you: your consciousness, your solidarity, your power. The empire thrives only because you believe its illusions. It survives only because you are kept too isolated to see your collective strength. The moment you organize, the moment you act with shared purpose, the spell breaks. The moment you recognize that the wealth of the world flows from your hands, not theirs, the ruling class stands exposed, dependent, fragile, terrified of the force it has attempted to suppress. The call before you is not merely to criticize, not merely to observe, not merely to analyze. It is to unite, to organize, to transform awareness into action grounded in justice, dignity, and the liberation of human potential. Not through chaos, not through destruction, but through disciplined, collective mobilization, the very form of power the system fears most. You are not passive observers of history. You are its engine, its authors, its architects. Break the illusions, reclaim your vision, recognize your worth. For when the working class stands together, when it refuses to be distracted, when it demands its rightful place in shaping society, the empire of illusions collapses and a new world, built on equality, solidarity, and human freedom, rises in its place. The future does not belong to those who rule today. The future belongs to those who awaken. Capitalism maintains power by creating illusions that distract workers from their exploitation, by constructing a social environment where appearances replace reality and where the mechanisms of control are disguised behind narratives of freedom, choice, and personal opportunity. This system thrives not because its foundations are just, but because its injustices are hidden beneath layers of ideology that shape how workers think, behave, and interpret their own conditions. Through the institutions of culture, media, education, and consumption, capitalism manufactures a worldview that makes exploitation appear natural, inevitable, or even beneficial. Workers are taught to see their struggles as personal shortcomings rather than structural outcomes, to interpret inequality as the result of effort rather than ownership, and to view wealth as a sign of merit instead of a symptom of systemic extraction. These illusions are not accidental. They are the ideological armor of capital, crafted across generations to keep workers focused on survival, competition, and distraction rather than on collective power or structural critique. The illusion of freedom is one of capitalism's strongest tools, presenting the worker as an autonomous individual who chooses how to live, work, and spend, while concealing the economic compulsion that forces them to sell their labor to survive. Workers are told they are free because they can choose between employers, yet every choice leads them back to the same dependence on wages that grant them only enough to return the next day. They are told they have freedom of consumption, yet those choices are shaped by the wages they receive and the markets that dictate what is available. They are told they have freedom of self-expression, yet even identity becomes another commodity to be purchased rather than a condition to be lived. In this landscape of false freedom, the worker moves through life believing they are in control, while the system defines the boundaries of every option they encounter. Another illusion that sustains capitalism is the constant promise of upward mobility, the narrative that anyone can rise through the ranks if they work hard enough. This myth reinforces obedience, encouraging workers to tolerate exploitation in exchange for the faint hope of escaping it. It pits workers against one another, transforming solidarity into rivalry and collective struggle into personal ambition. When only a tiny fraction ever ascend the hierarchy, their success is showcased as proof of the system's fairness, masking the reality that the vast majority remain in the same position regardless of effort. By elevating exceptional cases, capitalism creates the illusion that inequality is temporary and that structural barriers can be overcome by individual willpower, diverting attention from the systemic forces that maintain class divisions. Distraction is another essential function of capitalist illusion. The worker's attention is constantly pulled away from the causes of their suffering and redirected toward entertainment, consumption, and spectacle. The noise of everyday life becomes so overwhelming that reflection, analysis, and political thought rarely find space to grow. Workers are encouraged to immerse themselves in trends, media cycles, celebrity culture, and technological novelties, each designed to occupy the mind and prevent it from dwelling on the economic realities that shape existence. Even exhaustion serves as distraction. When workers are drained by long hours, unstable wages, and the rising cost of living, they lack the energy to question the system that produces those conditions. Fatigue becomes a silent weapon of capitalism, ensuring compliance not through force but through depletion. Another illusion lies in the portrayal of capitalism as the only viable system, the final stage of economic and social organization beyond which nothing more just or humane is possible. Workers are conditioned to view alternatives as unrealistic or dangerous, as though exploitation were a natural feature of human life rather than a historical construct sustained by specific relations of ownership and power. By convincing workers that there is no outside to the system, capitalism protects itself from ideological challenge, reducing imagination to a narrow corridor where only capitalist logic can fit. This sense of inevitability drains hope and prevents workers from envisioning a world where labor is not commodified and where human needs are not subordinated to profit. Yet perhaps the most powerful illusion capitalism maintains is the separation of individuals, the deliberate fragmentation of workers into isolated units who believe their struggles are private and disconnected from those of others. By promoting individualism, competition, and self-interest, capitalism obscures the collective nature of exploitation and prevents workers from recognizing the shared conditions that define their lives. Each worker sees only their own struggle, their own debts, their own exhaustion, never realizing these experiences are replicated across millions who share the same structural position. This isolation prevents solidarity, and without solidarity, the working class cannot confront the system that dominates it. Through these illusions, capitalism secures obedience without coercion, stability without legitimacy, and exploitation without resistance, maintaining power precisely because the workers who sustain it are taught not to see the change they carry. The working class produces all wealth, yet receives only a fraction of its value, because the structure of capitalism is built upon the extraction of surplus labor, the unpaid portion of the worker's effort that is appropriated by those who own the means of production. Every commodity, every service, every form of social wealth begins with labor, for without the worker's hands, knowledge, and time, nothing could be created or circulated. Yet the very individuals whose labor makes society function are systematically denied the full fruits of their work. Their wages are calculated not according to the true value they create, but according to the minimum the system requires to keep them returning to work each day. This gap between the value produced and the value received is the foundation of profit, and it is the reason why wealth accumulates in the hands of the few, while the many struggle to survive. The worker labors for hours beyond what is necessary for their own subsistence, and those additional hours become pure profit for the employer, absorbed as though it were the employer's contribution rather than the worker's unpaid time. This process of exploitation is concealed beneath layers of ideology that present wages as a fair exchange, as if the worker and the capitalist were equal participants entering a voluntary contract. But the worker does not meet the employer as an equal, they meet them out of necessity. The worker must sell their labor to live, while the capitalist purchases labor to increase their wealth. The employer's wealth grows precisely because the worker cannot demand the full value of what they create. If workers were compensated for the total value produced by their labor, profit would vanish, and the economic hierarchy that concentrates power in the hands of capitalists would collapse. Thus, the wage system operates as the linchpin of exploitation, disguising the transfer of wealth from labor to capital as a natural, even ethical, transaction. Workers are made to feel grateful for employment, unaware that their employment generates far more wealth for others than it ever will for themselves. This imbalance becomes visible in every sphere of social life. The working class, though responsible for generating society's wealth, often finds itself living paycheck to paycheck, burdened by debt, rising living costs, and the perpetual insecurity that defines modern capitalism. Meanwhile, those who profit from their labor enjoy lives of abundance, leisure, and power. The wealthiest members of society do not labor in proportion to their riches. Rather, their fortunes are built upon owning the instruments through which other people labor. The system rewards ownership, not contribution. It praises capital, not effort. And because ownership is concentrated in a small minority, wealth becomes equally concentrated, leaving the producers of wealth in a state of perpetual deprivation. This disparity is not an unfortunate flaw, but an intentional feature of the capitalist mode of production. The goal of the system is not to meet human needs, but to maximize profit, and profit is maximized precisely through extracting as much surplus labor as possible. The working class becomes valuable to capital only insofar as it produces more than it consumes. The pressure to work faster, longer, and more efficiently is driven not by human necessity, but by the demands of capital accumulation. Productivity increases through technology and organization, yet the benefits of that increased productivity rarely flow back to the workers who make it possible. Instead, the gains are absorbed by the owners, who use them to expand their enterprises, further entrenching their economic and political dominance. Even when wages rise, the proportion of wealth returned to the worker rarely matches the value extracted. Any increase in wages is often undermined by inflation, rising costs of housing, healthcare, education, and essential goods costs, driven upward by the very economic forces that exploit workers in the first place. Gains in productivity do not lead to shorter work days or improved conditions for the majority. They lead to greater profits for the minority. As a result, workers find themselves producing more wealth than any generation before them, while struggling harder to maintain basic living standards. The disconnect between production and compensation grows wider, reinforcing the class divide at the core of the system. The working class receives only a fraction of the wealth it creates because capitalism is structured to ensure that ownership yields power and profit while labor yields survival. The relationship between worker and capitalist is defined by this fundamental inequality, and no amount of reform can erase the underlying logic that drives it. At every turn, the system demands that workers create more while receiving less, for the prosperity of the few depends directly on the sacrifice of the many. The skyscrapers, the factories, the digital networks, the infrastructures of modern life, all of them are built by hands that remain unrecognized, underpaid, and undervalued. And yet society teaches workers to admire the wealth they create in others, to see the fortunes of the elite as a symbol of talent or innovation rather than the accumulated results of unpaid labor across generations. The truth that the working class creates all wealth yet receives only a fraction of it reveals the essence of class antagonism. As long as those who labor do not control the means of production, they will remain separated from the value they produce, generating riches for others while living in scarcity. This imbalance persists not through natural law, but through social relations maintained by institutions, ideology, and economic dependence, ensuring that the creators of wealth remain systematically deprived of its rewards. Disunity and distraction are deliberate tools used to weaken worker consciousness, because the ruling class understands that its power depends not only on economic control, but on the fragmentation of those whose labor sustains the entire system. A unified working class becomes capable of recognizing its collective exploitation, and such recognition threatens the stability of capitalist domination. To prevent this awakening, the system cultivates conditions where workers compete instead of cooperate, doubt instead of trust, and focus on trivialities instead of the structural forces shaping their lives. Every institution, from the media to the workplace, from political discourse to cultural norms, participates in this effort, often unconsciously, by reinforcing divisions that appear natural while serving the interests of capital. These divisions obscure the shared reality of exploitation, ensuring that workers see one another as obstacles rather than allies and view their struggles as isolated rather than interconnected. The workplace itself is engineered to foster competition, transforming potential solidarity into rivalry. Performance metrics, wage differences, promotions, and hierarchies generate an environment where workers measure their worth against one another instead of recognizing their common position within the system. A worker who is rewarded for outperforming colleagues learns to view them as adversaries rather than comrades. This competition fragments the working class into countless individuals pursuing personal advancement rather than collective liberation. The illusion of meritocracy amplifies this fragmentation, convincing workers that success or failure results solely from individual effort, thus obscuring the structural constraints that shape their lives. When people believe they rise or fall based on personal merit alone, they stop questioning the broader economic relations that determine who benefits from their labor. Beyond the workplace, capitalism exploits differences in identity such as nationality, race, ethnicity, religion, and culture to sow division among workers. These differences, which could enrich collective life, become tools for separation when manipulated by those who gain from conflict. Instead of recognizing the shared exploitation that transcends identity, workers are encouraged to blame one another for their hardships. Prejudices are cultivated, stereotypes reinforced, and social tensions inflamed so that workers remain too divided to see the common source of their suffering. As long as workers fight each other, they are prevented from confronting the structure that profits from their divisions. The ruling class, meanwhile, presents itself as neutral or benevolent, even as it benefits from the conflicts it quietly perpetuates. Distraction plays an equally crucial role in weakening worker consciousness, diverting attention away from the realities of exploitation and toward a constant stream of superficial concerns. Workers are bombarded with endless entertainment, consumer trends, sensational media, and political spectacle designed to occupy their mental space. This saturation leaves little room for reflection, analysis, or collective awareness. The more overstimulated workers become, the less likely they are to question the system or recognize their own power. Distraction transforms potential organizers into passive spectators, their energy consumed by the relentless cycle of information and entertainment that defines modern life. In such a climate, even dissatisfaction becomes individualized, expressed through personal frustration rather than organized resistance. The system further uses distraction to shape political consciousness, offering workers a narrow spectrum of choices that all operate within the same economic framework. Political debates are staged as grand conflicts while avoiding any challenge to the underlying relations of ownership and power. Workers are encouraged to become emotionally invested in these spectacles, mistaking them for genuine change. The focus shifts from systemic transformation to electoral theatre, from class struggle to partisan rivalry, keeping workers divided by loyalties that obscure their fundamental interests. This managed polarization ensures that political energy is spent on conflicts that leave the structure of exploitation untouched, reinforcing the illusion that change is occurring while the underlying system remains intact. Even the economic pressures imposed on workers serve as forms of distraction. When people struggle to pay rent, feed their families, or balance multiple jobs, they have little capacity to reflect on the root causes of their hardship. Exhaustion becomes an instrument of control, preventing workers from organizing or envisioning alternatives. The constant worry generated by insecurity and precarity drains mental and emotional resources, leaving workers vulnerable to manipulation and misinformation. Under such conditions, long-term thinking becomes a luxury, and collective action feels distant, even impractical. The system ensures that workers remain too overwhelmed by immediate survival to question the structures that make survival so difficult. Disunity and distraction operate together, reinforcing each other in subtle but powerful ways. Fragmentation prevents workers from seeing their collective strength, while distraction keeps them unaware of their shared conditions. As long as workers remain isolated and preoccupied, they are unable to recognize their role as the true foundation of society's wealth and power. Their disunity ensures the continued dominance of capital, which thrives on the inability of workers to form a unified front. By maintaining a state of division and confusion, the system protects itself from the transformative potential of organized, conscious labor. The weakening of worker consciousness is not an accidental byproduct of modern life, but a deliberate outcome of structures designed to preserve inequality and prevent collective resistance. Collective awareness and solidarity are the greatest threats to capitalist domination because they expose the fundamental dependency of the ruling class on the coordinated labor of the workers. Capitalism survives not because it is invincible, but because workers are kept fragmented, believing their struggles are isolated and their power insignificant. When workers become conscious of their shared exploitation and recognize that their individual hardships stem from the same structural forces, the facade of capitalist inevitability begins to fracture. Awareness transforms isolated dissatisfaction into collective understanding, and solidarity transforms scattered frustration into organized strength. The ruling class knows that its authority depends on the ignorance and separation of those who produce all wealth, which is why every institution works to maintain confusion, competition, and division. When workers see through these illusions and stand together, they challenge the core of capitalist power, revealing that the system relies entirely on their continued compliance. Collective awareness is dangerous to capitalism because it breaks the ideological spell that convinces workers to accept exploitation as natural. As long as workers attribute their hardships to personal failure, economic cycles, or individual misfortune, they remain trapped within the logic of the system. But when they recognize that low wages, long hours, precarity, and rising costs are not personal problems but structural necessities of capital, the relationship between labor and ownership becomes clear. Awareness reveals that capitalist profit is not a reward for innovation or risk, but the direct extraction of surplus labor from workers. It reveals that inequality is not an accident but an outcome engineered by the distribution of property and power. It reveals that the wealth of the few rests entirely on the unpaid labor of the many. Once workers understand this, the legitimacy of capitalist domination erodes, replaced by the recognition that the working class has both the right and the ability to reshape society. Solidarity amplifies this awareness by transforming knowledge into collective capacity. A single worker may understand exploitation, but an isolated individual cannot confront a system built on concentrated wealth and institutional power. Solidarity unites these individuals into a coherent force capable of challenging the ruling class. It dissolves the divisions that capitalism relies on, divisions of race, nationality, gender, skill, and status, and replaces them with a sense of shared purpose rooted in the material interests of the working class. When workers realize that they have more in common with each other across borders than with the elites within their own nations, capitalism's strategy of fragmentation loses its effectiveness. Solidarity turns millions of isolated workers into a collective voice that can demand change, not as supplicants, but as the creators of all wealth. Capitalism fears solidarity because it disrupts the smooth functioning of exploitation. The system depends on labor being reliable, divided, and controlled. Solidarity makes labor unpredictable, unified, and capable of resistance. A unified workforce can strike, organize, demand better conditions, and challenge the prerogatives of capital. It can slow production, disrupt profits, and expose the vulnerability of a system that pretends to be all-powerful. Solidarity does not merely challenge the economic operations of capitalism, it challenges its ideological and political foundations. It proves that power does not reside in boardrooms, banks, or markets, but in the collective action of workers who choose not to comply with their own subordination. The ruling class therefore invests enormous resources into preventing solidarity. It uses propaganda to pit workers against each other, portraying them as competitors rather than comrades. It weaponizes identity, nationality, and culture to create artificial divisions. It foments prejudice, stokes fear, and spreads narratives that portray certain groups of workers as threats rather than allies. It privileges some sectors of the working class with slightly better wages or conditions to create internal hierarchies that fragment potential unity. It infiltrates movements, undermines organizing efforts, and uses the legal system to restrict collective action. All of these measures aim to ensure that workers remain divided, because even a hint of solidarity threatens the system's stability. Collective awareness also challenges the psychological foundations of capitalism, which depend on the belief that the system is both natural and eternal. When workers recognize their collective position, they begin to imagine alternatives. They begin to envision a society where labor is not exploited, where wealth is not concentrated in the hands of a minority, and where social institutions serve human needs rather than profit. This imagination alone is destabilizing to capitalism because it breaks the illusion that there is no other way to organize society. Awareness opens the door to consciousness, and once consciousness spreads, capitalism can no longer rely on resignation to sustain itself. When awareness and solidarity combine, they form the foundation for collective power. This power emerges from the recognition that workers, united by shared interests and equipped with a clear understanding of their exploitation, possess the capacity to transform social relations. Capitalism cannot function without their labor, and it cannot survive when they refuse to accept the conditions imposed on them. Collective awareness reveals the nature of exploitation, and solidarity provides the means to confront it. Together, they represent the single greatest threat to capitalist domination because they awaken the working class to its own potential and its ability to reshape the world according to principles of equality, dignity, and shared human flourishing. Only organized, unified workers can dismantle oppressive systems and reclaim their power, because no individual, no matter how determined or aware, can confront structures that function through concentrated wealth, institutional authority, and deeply embedded ideologies. Oppressive systems are not upheld by the strength of the ruling class alone, but by the fragmentation, isolation, and disorganization of those who labor beneath them. When workers remain scattered, each struggling in isolation, their grievances are absorbed by the system without consequence. But when they come together in disciplined, collective forms of organization, their scattered frustrations transform into a force capable of challenging the very foundations of exploitation. Organization converts awareness into strategy, solidarity into action, and dissatisfaction into pressure that the ruling class cannot ignore. Without unity, workers are merely individuals facing overwhelming power. With unity, they become the decisive majority, whose cooperation is indispensable to the functioning of society. Oppressive systems maintain themselves by dividing workers along lines that appear natural but are engineered. Differences in occupation, wage level, nationality, ethnicity, gender, religion, or perceived status. These divisions weaken the capacity of workers to recognize their shared position and their shared interests. A worker who sees themselves as separate from others in the same economic condition becomes easier to control, easier to pacify, and easier to exploit. Organization is the means through which these artificial divisions are dissolved. It creates a structure that emphasizes common interests over superficial differences, reminding workers that regardless of occupation or identity, they face the same fundamental relation to capital. Organized unity allows workers to understand that their struggles are not personal misfortunes but collective experiences, rooted in the same system that prioritizes profit over people. Through organization, workers develop the ability to coordinate their actions, challenge unfair conditions, and negotiate from a position of strength rather than desperation. Power under capitalism is not possessed individually but collectively. The system relies on the cooperation of millions who labor, produce, and serve. When those millions refuse to cooperate with injustice through peaceful protest, unionization, coordinated bargaining, or other forms of collective pressure, the ruling class loses its ability to extract surplus from them. The system cannot function if those who make it run cease to accept its terms. Organization gives workers the framework to act together, to plan strategically, and to channel their power in ways that reveal the dependence of capital on labor. Without organized action, resistance becomes sporadic and easily repressed. With organization, resistance becomes durable and capable of shaping long-lasting change. Unified workers can dismantle oppressive systems because they represent the vast majority of society, the very foundation upon which economic and social life is built. The strength of the working class does not lie in wealth or ownership, but in numbers, in cooperation, and in their essential role in maintaining production and social infrastructure. When workers recognize that they collectively hold the real power to operate or halt the machinery of society, the authority of the ruling class becomes symbolic rather than material. Oppressive systems rely on the belief that workers are powerless. Unified organization breaks that belief and replaces it with the awareness that workers are indispensable. Their labor creates goods, moves supply chains, sustains services, and maintains the basic functioning of daily life. When organized, workers can harness this indispensability to demand fair treatment, equitable distribution of resources, and institutional accountability. Organization also equips workers with the intellectual and emotional capacity needed for sustained change. Oppressive systems do not fall simply because they are challenged. They persist through legal, ideological, and social resistance to transformation. Disorganized workers may feel initial passion but lack the structure to maintain momentum. Organized workers, however, build institutions and relationships that support long-term struggle. They cultivate leaders, develop strategies, educate members, and create networks that allow movements to endure even when confronted with setbacks. Organization turns spontaneous anger into disciplined determination, making it possible for workers to persist through the inevitable difficulties of transforming entrenched structures. It creates continuity, memory, and a shared vision that cannot be easily dismantled by external pressures. Unified organization empowers workers to reclaim their power by giving them the tools to articulate their needs, demand structural changes, and participate in shaping the future rather than being passive subjects of it. Through democratic, peaceful, and collective action, they can challenge systems that have long profited from their silence. They can push for new forms of governance, new economic arrangements, and new social priorities that center human dignity rather than profit. The process of reclaiming power is not merely about resisting oppression, but about building alternative forms of collective life, where workers have a voice, where decisions reflect the needs of the many, and where the value created by labor is shared more justly. Only through organized unity can this shift occur. For without it, the workers' potential remains dormant, scattered, and unable to confront the magnitude of the systems that dominate them. In the end, the truth stands unmasked. The power of capitalism does not lie in its illusion of strength, but in the silence, division, and resignation of those who sustain it. Every chain that binds the working class is forged from their own unclaimed power. Every injustice maintained by their coerced obedience, every structure of domination upheld by the belief that nothing can change. But the moment workers see through the illusions, when they recognize that the wealth of the world is built by their hands, that their labor moves history, that their unity is the force capital fears above all else, the foundations of oppression begin to tremble. The empire of illusions survives only as long as workers do not look beyond its walls. Once they awaken to their collective strength, the system that fed on secrecy, distraction, and division loses its authority. The future belongs not to those who hoard wealth, but to those who create it. Not to the few who profit from exploitation, but to the many who make society possible. When workers reject fragmentation, when they organize with purpose, when they stand together with clarity and resolve, they reclaim the power that has always been theirs. And in that moment of shared consciousness, the possibility of a new world emerges, one shaped not by the logic of capital, but by the dignity, solidarity, and collective will of the working class.